So seeing that it's now officially 1 o'clock, I am going to go ahead and begin this webinar. We do know that a few people will be trickling in a bit late as they're jumping from 12 o'clock meetings to 1 o'clock meetings. But by way of introduction, my name is Nicole Highmark, and I am the Executive Director of Reaching Higher New Hampshire. And joining me today on the panel and co-host from Reaching Higher, we have Christina Pretorius, who is our Policy Director, and we have Matt Girding, who is our Policy Analyst. So we are thrilled to have both of them here to assist with this presentation, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So today is a briefing on the proposed rule changes to the minimum standards for public school approval. And Christine, I'm going to ask you to advance the slide, please. And there are a few things I want to share in setting a foundation for today's conversation. And we want to begin by reminding everybody on this afternoon's call about who we are and what we do. So we are Reaching Higher New Hampshire, and we are the state's public education policy resource center, and really pride ourselves on that. But more importantly, we wish to highlight our vision. And here at Reaching Higher New Hampshire, we have a long-term vision where Granite Staters have a deeply held conviction that public education is one of our state's most precious assets. And all our public schools are strongly supported by their surrounding communities, thriving with the benefit of committed local and state support for achieving great student outcomes. We work really hard to inform the discussions around education policies themselves, building capacity, and empowering individuals and communities. We engage people through partnerships, through coalition building, storytelling, and more in support of the next generation of education. So that reminds folks about really who we are and why we exist. But now I want to segue to really today's focus and what we're going to be talking about. And the purpose of today's webinar is to inform our network. There's a targeted audience for this presentation, and it is Reaching Higher New Hampshire's education network. And we want to inform our network about the proposed key changes to the minimum standards for public school approval. It is impossible for us to offer an overview on all the changes. So therefore, today's focus is on the most critical, the most significant changes that we wish to highlight based on our analysis of the proposed document. The presentation will detail Reaching Higher New Hampshire's key findings as a result of our analysis of the draft standards. And just as a reminder, really to connect us on today's focus and to the previous slide that spoke about who we are, and reminding you of our vision. And thinking about that vision and who we are, the minimum standards are among the most critical policy matters of our time and for our organization, as they impact each and every single student, educator, and family in this state who has a relationship with their local public school. So that's why we're bringing this content to you today, largely because it really is important and the findings need to be shared. As for how today's focus will go and how we shape the agenda, we're going to speak to you about what the minimum standards for public school approval are and why they exist. We're going to explore the process for revising them. And then where we're going to spend most of our time is highlighting and detailing the key themes, again, based upon Reaching Higher New Hampshire's analysis and our overall conclusions of the current draft of standards we have reviewed. And I think that's a really important point in setting the stage for today's conversation, is we expect there to be additional drafts, new drafts. This is very much an iterative process. So what is shared with you today is really meant to report on the latest draft that exists. You can see there is an opportunity to pose questions in the Q&A box, and that Q&A box will send questions to our panelist and our moderator. And Matt Girding, our policy analyst, is really our moderator for today. So on that note, I'm going to take a break from speaking, and I'm going to pass the baton to Christina.
Thanks so much, Nicole, now that I'm unmuted. Just wanted to start out by giving everyone a brief understanding of what the minimum standards for public school approval are. I think, for many of us, this may be the first time that we start to really think and unpack these administrative rules. And so we wanted to kind of set a groundwork. So these are the administrative rules, Ed 306s. All schools must meet these minimum standards in order to be approved as a public school by the Department of Education, be recognized as a public school by the state. So they are really important. And so, we're gonna dive into that, but just you're gonna hear words like foundational quite a bit throughout the presentation. And that really is, in recognition of what the minimum standards for public school approval are. There, schools can go above and beyond, but this is really the expectations that we have for each and every public school in the state. So as I said, these are found in administrative rules, in Education 306. They are adopted as such, since they are administrative rules, they are adopted by the New Hampshire State Board of Education. They go through the same process. The last revision was in 2014, and so these would legally be up for a revision in 2024. So this is a little bit earlier than, the typical 10-year process for rules, but, it is getting to the end of that cycle. And, we do want to be clear that these rules apply to public schools and public academies. So charter schools, private schools, adult high schools, learn everywhere programs, those are housed in different places in administrative rules. These are really talking about our public schools and our public academies. And when we go through our key themes, that's something to really keep in mind, that, we're talking about public schools. And so, when we think about alternative programs, those kinds of things, those are housed in other places. To give you an idea of the scope of the minimum standards, they are vast. They cover policy requirements. They cover culture and climate, school facilities, food and nutrition services, staff qualifications, the approval process, assessment, all of these really important factors. And as such, they are really, really, really long. And as Nicole had said, there were a lot of revisions. There are a lot of proposed revisions in this latest draft. The work group focused a lot on curriculum, learning, that kind of thing. Didn't necessarily go a lot into food and nutrition services, health services, those kinds of things, or things like support services, really focusing on curriculum and how school works. But as you can see, we'll revisit this in just a minute, but the minimum standards for public school approval are pretty vast. And so now, we're going to transition. I do want to set the stage a little bit. We're going to transition to the process that these have gone under. This process was started in early 2021. Actually, the contract was approved in late 2020. And so, we're going to look at the process because, as Nicole said, this is based on a draft. And so far, there has been very little transparency in the process for these massive revisions. And so we're going to start off actually with looking at a similar a process that had a similar outcome, a proposal for rules to the State Board of Education, but ended up being really, really different. And so we're going to take this example of the Holocaust and Genocide standards. So these were crafted by a Commission on Holocaust and Genocide Education. The process was pretty straightforward. It had a pretty wide membership that included teachers, it included school admins, curriculum coordinators, experts in the field, people who had direct experience with the subject area. They had public recorded meetings. So you can go back and you can watch those YouTube meetings where this commission met to talk about these proposals, these standards, and that kind of thing. They had public minutes. They had contact information for members. So this was a fairly transparent process for a really important issue. These are new standards. They are on an incredibly important topic. And there was a lot of transparency around how they came about and what the process was. The group met in 2020 and 2021. So it is under the same administration as we are right now. And they drafted standards to be presented to the state board, which the state board then later adopted. On the left here, you'll see screenshots of the commission's website, which is hosted by Keene State College. You can see, links to their minutes. You can see resources for educators. You can see the commission charge, the specific state legislation that created the commission and created the necessity for these standards. So very transparent. And even though the state board did adopt these, they are still living on this website, accessible to the public. And so now let's compare that to this process. And just to be clear, the Holocaust and genocide standards are within the 306s, but let's look at this process. The New Hampshire Department of Education contracted with a third-party company, the National Center for Competency-Based Learning, to draft the minimum standards in November 2020. That contract is publicly available, and you can find it on the GNC website. The members of the task force were selected by NCCBL, and there are still no public documents regarding the makeup of the committee. So if you wanted to find out where are they, you'd have to ask directly, I guess. We know the makeup of the committee because of word of mouth, because of conversations that we've had, but thus far, there's not the same level of transparency as there was to, say, the Holocaust and Genocide Standards Commission. There were no public meetings. There are no public minutes of those meetings. There's really been little opportunity for public input at all up to this point. About a year ago, a little more into the process, about a year ago in last summer, the task force completed their draft. They sent it to the department. Still, the draft has not been released to the public. We know that, the New Hampshire Department of Ed and NCCBL work pretty closely on revisions. And as of right now, they sit with 4 associations for feedback, still, not public. It is expected, it says in the contract, that NCCBL is expected to facilitate meetings with professional associations throughout the state, listening sessions in the fall. The timeframe for that is still unknown. And also, we're really unclear on the end date to these. When will these draft rules be presented to the state board? When will they be finalized? When will they be presented? We've heard a number of different things. We've heard later this fall. We've heard, by the end of the year. We've heard in January, but still very little clarity on the process. And this is really important because, when we're talking about something as important as the minimum standards for public school approval, these are so consequential to our public schools, to our students, to our families, and to our communities, that it's really important that, we're all on the same page on what the proposals are, how these things are changing. Sorry. Right, my son asked for fruit snacks. And so, just to double down again, comparing the two processes, Holocaust and genocide standards, everything public, you can still access it. 306 revisions, not so much. And I'm flashing this on the screen too, and it's the scope of the minimum standards. So we're talking about this big umbrella, all of these pieces that are included in the 306s. And, I showed this before, really broad. And so we wanted to take an opportunity, we don't want to call out anyone who's on the committee. We appreciate their work immensely. There were some really great people, some great allies on that group, but there were a significant amount of missing voices. So there were no certified practicing teachers from any level, from elementary, middle, high school, or from specific content areas. There were no, practicing certified special educators, no school nurses, school counselors, CTE educators. when we get to a couple of our pieces later, one of our key themes, there were no DEIJ coordinators, no one in that room that has a lens of looking at policies and processes having to do with equity and inclusion. There was nobody in that room that really looked at these with that lens. There were no students on the committee. There were no family representatives, mental health. And so, when we look at the scope and then we look at the committee makeup, I think there's a big point here of, who was at the table and where could we have gone there. So there were a lot of changes in this proposal. We've condensed them to 5 key themes, and I will say that this we had simplified it quite a bit. There were a lot of changes, but we will not be going through all of them today. If you have any questions, please drop them into the Q&A. We will have our emails at the end, and follow up with us. We'd love to have a discussion with you, whatever it is, talk more, continue, give this presentation. If you have people who are also interested, we're happy to do that. So, we've distilled these changes to the 5 key themes, and those are equity and student protections, gutting of program elements, changes around local control, a new requirement that appears to be pretty major, and some changes in definitions that really raised our eyebrows, and we want to know more about them, and we want to share our findings. So with that, let's dive in. I'm going to start with equity and student protections, and then I'm going to pass it off to Nicole. But, we really wanted to lead with equity because this theme, it's fundamental to everything that we do at Reaching Higher. We have a core belief, and our core mission is around ensuring that every single student in New Hampshire has the opportunity for a high quality public education. So, when we think about rules, when we think about policies, we're really looking at it with an equity lens and seeing, how will this impact all of our students, especially our most vulnerable. And so this theme really does cascade down into every other section. And so that's why we're really starting with that. So exploring our first key theme in equity, the first rule change that really caught our eye was changing the stated protected classes to any and all. And so this was pretty concerning to us, particularly in the current political context. We know from the state anti-discrimination laws, particularly with divisive concepts, that broadening to the point of ambiguity really puts educators, schools, school administrators in a really difficult position. That legislation being specific and direct and expanding the umbrella rather than doing away with it altogether provides school leaders, staff, and educators with the guidance they need and to eliminate confusion. And I really, really want to be clear here that as originally proposed, this rule was by no means perfect, but this was an opportunity for the people who were involved, the work group, NCCBL, and the department to adopt meaningful rules that will create welcoming, affirming spaces for our students, educators, and staff. They could have reworked this. If they're changing it, they could have reworked it to make a more proactive policy, but instead they really introduced more ambiguity. Another change that we noticed was the removal of the requirement that school administrators and staff work together to establish a fair and equitable code of discipline. And now we know that there have been changes made in the past few years legislatively regarding student discipline, mostly around exclusionary practices like suspensions and expulsions specifically. But this elimination in particular really caught our eye. New Hampshire really struggles with inequitable disciplinary practices. There have been numerous reports. There was one in 2019 that was really a foundation for recent legislation that noted that, our students of color, our students with disabilities are typically punished more severely and more often than their peers. And this was really an opportunity for the state to build on requirements for schools and staff to work together to create a more just learning environment for students. And we just didn't see that here. By eliminating this, we did not see that. Additionally, the proposed changes require require districts to adopt a plan to, quote, address academic underperformance. This is not defined in the rules. And we also wanted to note this tone shift. So the review ways in which equity gaps in achievement can be reduced and barriers to learning can be eliminated. That was the old rule, and it was changed to develop a plan to address academic underperformance of individual students. And so, again, there's a lot of room for growth in the original rule, for sure, but changing it to, this tone of academic underperformance, concentrating on, how a student is underperforming, that was really concerning to us, and it really set a different tone. It sets a different tone. Instead of, reducing gaps and eliminating barriers, you're talking about students and their underperformance. So that one was also really, really concerning to us. So, looking at the questions and the implications, the part about elimination of protected classes is one that we would like to really lean in on. And as I said, they weren't perfect before, but this was really an opportunity for the state to seize the moment and really move forward policy that creates these welcoming, affirming, and safe places for students. And we have some of these other takeaways, but really, if there's one thing that I would like you to take away from this equity piece, it's that the NCCBL, the department, they really had the opportunity to hone in on school culture and climate, to make it stronger, to make these policies stronger, so that we can have supportive spaces for our students, our educators, and our staff. And so that's something that we really want to take away. That was one of our biggest takeaways. Students need safe places in order to be able to learn and to live up to their potential. And if we need those policies in place to enable and really move forward a positive school climate and school culture for students. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nicole for talking about program elements.
Okay, thank you, Christina. And as I lean into the next theme, which is the second of our 5 themes of gutting program elements, I want to remind folks of Christina's point about the cascading implications of equity and student protections, because you're going to hear us throughout this presentation really address, through all 5 of these themes, a sub-theme or a sub-idea of equity and how some of these other changes impact equitable access and these safe, welcoming learning environments. So I'm going to speak to actually the next 3 themes, this one being the gutting of program elements and replacing those program elements with boilerplate language. But before we get into those specific slides, there's a really important orientation or language point that I want to highlight. Here at Reaching Higher, we are calling them program elements. But when you dig into the rules, when you look at either the current rules that are in effect for schools or the proposed rules, you'll see that they are referenced as program standards. And we feel program elements is a better term to use to highlight this section of the rules, because this section is about all the ingredients that go in to a specific program in a content area that provides its foundation, but offers enough guidance to people, to really schools and educators for that matter, in constructing that program. So you'll hear me throughout this section talk about program elements. And furthermore, we want to use elements because there's a really, really important distinction we want to make. Most of us are familiar with the term standards, particularly when we're talking about programs or content areas, as academic standards, as state academic standards, as national academic standards. And the intent here in New Hampshire, in the administrative rules, when we talk about program elements, it's not limited to academic standards. It's really a more holistic approach to what are the elements that need to be in place for students to ensure that they have a quality learning program within that content area. So we're going to go to the next slide. And I'm going to speak a little bit more to what program elements are designed to provide within the ED 306 rules, which are the rules for public school approval. And they exist to really provide a framework first and foremost to educators and schools for building their learning programs, for designing those learning programs at the local level. They identify the very basic elements or tenets that exist in each content area to ensure that all students in New Hampshire, despite the school that they attend, have equitable student experiences. So really laying that foundation, laying that groundwork that is required for all programs in all schools, and then schools can customize from there. So some ways to think about this, or some specific examples of ways to think about this, is program elements tend to include direction on how educators both design, evaluate, reflect, and then revise the curriculum that supports the program. They also get into matters like assessment and what are the best practices in assessment in how we explore student mastery of specific content. So these elements really convey the minimum expectation for learning programs, the floor from which all schools and educators design learning from, and from which students engage. So we're going to move on. And in thinking about the gutting of these program elements, we felt it best really to give our attendees, to give our network examples of what has happened in the rules. So what you see on the screen right now is actually a sampling of current program elements that exist within our business education rules that are a part of the minimum standards that are in effect right now. So ED 306.33 specifically. And when you look at this sampling, you see that it highlights elements that go well beyond the academic standards or the state and national standards. And we're talking about essential ingredients that are captured here for students engaging in a business education program. And all of these ingredients really design or contribute to what would be a well-rounded program design or a well-rounded framework that promotes that equity and common foundation for students. So you see learning activities and preparations that students have to be able to engage in the business world. You see planned activities, so lesson plans and activities that students really need to engage in to build their knowledge, enhance their knowledge, and ensure that they have understanding. You see a reference to real world skills that students have to have when they depart our high schools and move on to career or college or any sort of post-secondary exploration, and that's job applications and interviewing. And then you also see that we have some really specific examples about assessment here, and that students need to be assessed, authentically. So in real world contexts, and also formatively, which means along the way, and then summatively, which is at the end, to make sure that they have mastery of content, mastery of understanding. And that can be done in a variety of ways, through teachers observing student performance, through performance-based assessments, and that really speaks to that authentic piece, to common assessments that are shared across the district, that are shared across educators, and then project evaluation, projects that are evaluated through, a carefully designed rubric. So just as a reminder, this is what it sits in the current business education rules. And we're going to segue to the next slide to really showcase what we mean about this point of gutting program elements. And what you see on this slide is what currently exists in the latest draft of the proposed ED 306.33 rule, which is the proposed rule for business education standards. And you see there is greatly limited guidance offered here to schools for program design. And you'll find that the language you're seeing on this side is mirrored, is boilerplate language that is copied and pasted into each program element in the minimum standards. So that could be English language arts and reading, that could be sciences, that could be fine arts education and fine arts program. It really is just this language that's been replicated throughout all the program standards, throughout all the program requirements. So the new language, actually, Christina, can I have you go back for one moment? So the new language really focuses on comprehensive, developmentally appropriate, personalized and sequential business education. And these are all relevant elements. But what is also missing here is we don't know what is intended by comprehensive. We don't know what is intended by developmentally appropriate. These terms are not defined. So again, it's offering this ambiguity to our schools and districts from which they build their programs. So now I'm going to have us jump to the next slide. And we felt here at Reaching Higher that it would be important to showcase this through a couple of different examples so that our network could see where we are right now in the rules that are currently in effect and where that proposed revision is going. So this is an example for our current English language arts and reading rules. And you'll see again that there's a great deal of specificity here. And we see that these are elements, again, that go beyond that notion of academic standards. So we see elements that detail expectations for actually the learning environment and what creates a good learning environment and good learning culture in English language arts and reading. We see ways of supporting our educators in this example of program elements, as well as professional learning expectations for all instructional staff. So that's talking about professional learning for our certified educators, but also our paraprofessionals, our content area teachers, for our interventionists, for our support staff. So I imagine the point has been made, but we really want folks to see what these elements have looked like. And then if we jump to the next slide, the direction the current proposed draft is going. And that is, again, a nod to this sort of boilerplate language that has been copied throughout all the programs that reside in the minimum standards for school approval. You will see 3 bullet points on the screen right now for this example, because in some of the content areas like ELA and reading or science or the social sciences, we see the elements break down to learning levels 1 through 8, then elements for middle school and elements for high school. And we largely see the exact same language. The difference we see at the high school level, so 9 through 12 specifically, is about courses and course design and that learning progression and what needs to be offered at a minimum level in those courses that and learning design that high schools offer. So that brings us to the next slide. And you're probably picking up on a theme in this presentation that we highlight sort of open questions and implications within each theme. And for this theme, we really see the implications centering on teachers and students. And for teachers, is the open question is there enough detail? Is there enough of a foundation offered in the language that currently sits in the revision to offer our educators guidance in the design of their programs, in their learning design? And then more importantly, when we become student-centered, which Christina has spoken to really through the equity lens, is does this stripping of detail and best practice move us from equitable learning environments, move us away from equitable learning environments, and a commitment to ensuring a common foundation for all students. And our worry is, without some detail, we're going to see a widening of the opportunity gap for students. So that'll bring us to our third theme, which focuses on local control. And there are really three major takeaways in this, but in introducing this theme, we focus largely on the removal of locally developed competencies and the role of certified educators in granting credit. So we're going to transition to the next slide. And I'll highlight again, there are three sort of sub-themes within this overarching idea of local control. And the proposed rules really move in a direction of reducing the scope of competencies, because what has happened in the revision, what has happened in the proposal is simply the word competency is used. So remaining true to a competency-based learning environment, but no longer in the rules do we see reference to district, content, and graduation competencies. And for clarification, district competencies are typically, in most school districts, district-wide, adopted by the local school board on a K-12 or pre-K through 12 level. Content competencies are also district-wide, but they're unique to that content area or unique to the particular design of a learning experience or the design of a course. So high school biology, for example. And then graduation competencies oftentimes link to school districts' work in defining what their graduates want to look like. So when a student exits our local school system, what are the essential elements or competencies that graduate needs to demonstrate? So they're district-wide, they're very much cumulative in nature. The next point is in the proposed rules, and this, I'm going to be very honest to our audience, was startling. The proposed rules actually eliminate the mention of mastery of competency, which was used in the current version of the 306s. And under the proposed draft rules, districts would be required to graduate students based on the acknowledgement of competency. So we've seen a removal of mastery of competency and a move in the direction of acknowledgement of competencies. And this is a pretty significant change that potentially has really serious implications. And this change is particularly important to note when we're talking about learning experiences or courses that build on each other or have prerequisites. Some of the easy examples that come to mind are in the area of mathematics and world language. So it asks or it invites, why not mastery? Why this change? What was the thinking behind it? And then lastly, and again, I would highlight as equally important, is the proposed revision to remove the role of certified educators in determining student competency. So no longer would a certified educator be the only one or the individual in the role to approve a student's demonstration of competency. And this really appears, and this is going to be a strong statement, but this appears to be a disregard for the expertise of our certified educators, really ensuring that students move on when ready. So those are the three big sub takeaways in this discussion of local control. But before I move on to the next theme, I do want to spend a little bit of time noodling on this point about acknowledgement versus mastery. And I'm going to speak to it really through a really simple example. And we're going to use an analogy of a hammer and a nail. And the shift from acknowledgement to mastery is really quite simply like this. Under acknowledgement, the teacher is saying that, yes, a student can hit a nail with a hammer. They know how to hit a nail with a hammer. We acknowledge that they know how to use the hammer and check. But when we think about this analogy and when we think about mastery, mastery is the student knowing what to do when something happens to the nail. So in this graphic, in this example, it'd be when the nail bends. What do we do with the nail? Or what if the nail splinters the wood, or the nail goes out of the side of the wood? So in that case, they don't know, they know much more than hitting the nail with the hammer. They've mastered the hammer in such a way as how to use it in novel, in some more unpredictable situations, in some scenarios that really involve some problem solving. So we felt it was really important to show that shift and what the implication could be for our students and for our schools. So moving on to the questions and implications within this theme built around local control. One wide open question that really will need to be explored over the process of the drafting and redrafting of these standards and the listening sessions or the forums and conversations with professional associations is what precisely is the impact on already developed local competencies, on the locally developed competency assessments, and on graduation requirements, especially given we've altogether removed references to content, to course, to graduation competencies. And then the second question that builds off this are, what are the implications for high school credit when the threshold for credit has moved away from mastery and in the direction of acknowledgement? And those are really wide open to us at this time. So I think that's enough covering the theme of local control. And this next theme is going to be much more brief than the previous three. And before we jump into definitions, and this is really beginning to explore a new requirement that has landed in the minimum standards for school approval. And that new requirement is built around a personal learning plan. And as I said, PLPs are altogether a new requirement that really is yet to be reflected in any state legislation to date. So their first emergence really is in this draft proposal for minimum standards. And this appears to be the most significant new requirement, which is why we're focusing on this one specifically. Other states have shifted to personal learning plans, or they're often referred to as PLPs. And you can see one of those states, it's just to our west in the state of Vermont. And they made that shift in 2013. And their personal learning plan really is a student-led process. It involves students identifying goals, drafting action steps, assessing their process, or progress, and reflecting and revising. And while it's a student-centered and student-led process, it is educator supported. And that is a really important note. So when we begin to look at this new requirement and move in the direction of questions and implications, so I'm going to ask us to jump to the next slide. There are a few different questions that emerged for us that we would like to share with the network. And the first one is there legislation that would be required to put PLPs into practice or into place in school districts in the state? Does the New Hampshire Education Department have the authority yet, or do they need the enabling legislation to put this new requirement into place for our schools, our districts, our students and educators? And then once in place, what support is the New Hampshire Education Department going to provide to schools in terms of professional learning, in terms of resources, so that educators can, work with their students and meet these new requirements? And what does technical assistance look like? What does that training? What could those resources really be? And as we explore, those two bullets in the middle around resources and professional learning, it also invites the question about funding and how will this effort be supported, both in terms of support toward teachers, but also financially, so that our schools and students can meet this new expectation. And then the last piece, and our team really doesn't have the expertise here, and Christina highlighted at the top of this presentation that special educators were not a part of this revision, but one of the big questions we are seeing emerge with personal learning plans is students who have individualized education programs, or IEPs. They already have a federally mandated learning plan. So how is that federally mandated learning plan impacted by this new requirement for a personalized learning plan? So on that note, we are going to move to our fifth and final theme, and that is in the area of definitions. And I am going to pass this back to Christina.
Thanks, Nicole. Really appreciate it. So, we're going to explore some definitions, some terminology changes throughout the rule revisions, the proposed rule revisions. One of the biggest ones that really caught our eye was the change from courses to learning opportunities. And we see this throughout the document. We really want to be clear. And the reason that we had brought up the other rule sections that had other, the non-public school rules, ED 1400s, which is the Learn Everywhere rules, there are existing rules around extended learning opportunities. This is really broadening it. So this isn't talking about necessarily just those, just learning extended ELOs, just, Learn Everywhere programs. This is really taking all of the references to courses and changing them to learning opportunities. And this was really caught our eye because it made us ask, what classifies as a learning opportunity? What could be counted as a learning opportunity? Could a soccer practice be counted? All those kinds of things. So what are we talking about here when we're talking about the minimum standards for public school approval? One of the other changes is instructional to learning. So throughout the rules, there's that change from instructional resources, instructional technologies, to learning resources, learning technologies, and all of those kinds of things. So it really invites, the question of what's the goal here? What's the end game? A couple of the other changes are the definition of instructional time. So the rules change from instructional time where students are in the building, they're actively learning toward achieving educational objectives. This gets switched to the period of time in which the school day in which the school is offering instruction. So that's a pretty substantial change. We're still exploring what that means in practice, what that means for schools, what that means for school funding, for those kinds of things. So that's another definition where we had some questions. And then finally, the length of the school year that reflects advancement based on competency, not seat time. And this was one that we would have expected if these rules, we know that these rules were at their core going towards a competency-based education system. And so, going from seat time to competency, that's nothing new in the state of New Hampshire, but we did want to bring that to your attention that there is that change. And so when we think about these key themes, when we think about these questions and implications, what's the purpose of changing courses to learning opportunities, from talking about, these foundational requirements for public schools to these really open-ended learning opportunities that aren't really defined, talking about instructional to learning, that change with instructional time definition. One of the places, we're in thinking about impacts to students, to families, to access, and then also talking about, school resourcing. Could this potentially impact school funding, the amount of resources that schools have to meet the needs of their students? And in taking all of these as well, particularly the courses to learning opportunities and the instructional to learning, there is a national movement that we have our eye on. It's called unbundling. That is breaking up of school to its least common denominator, breaking it up into pieces so that you can outsource, so that private outside organizations can pick those pieces. And we've seen that as a theme. And in reading some of these changes, we really started to get those unbundling vibes, particularly, you know, with that switch from instruction to learning opportunities, particularly with the de-emphasis on professional certified teachers. We started to get that feeling. And here, I won't read them fully, but here are two quotes from an Excel in Ed conference in 2021 and an Ed Choice article from August 2020 about unbundling. And so, you know, it's talking about using pods, micro schools, part-time public school enrollment, parent-directed funding, which is really a code for school vouchers, to really break apart public schools and bring in these other programs. And, you know, this piece from Ed Choice really resonated, you know, in thinking about some of these changes. Rather than operating classes in-house that might be expensive or difficult to find great teachers for, imagine if they simply paid for students to get that learning somewhere else in the community. And we have seen that happen in other states. I believe Indiana has a very similar program where their schools, they offer a partial voucher so that their public school students can go and get things out. So what that does is that really starts to disintegrate our public schools. And, you know, it may seem like a bit of a leap, but in thinking about the current context right now, you know, for our network members who've been plugged in for a while, you know, there's a lot of conversations at the grass tops level. We say a lot, you know, that the conversation is shifting from how do we fund our public schools to should we fund our public schools? We're grappling with a severely inequitable system of how we pay for our schools. And really over the past 2 years, we've seen a lot of efforts to privatize public education. And so when we look at these changes, we also look at it in this lens, in the state and national context. And so those are pieces that really raised our eyebrows, and we have some very strong concerns with, and we have a lot of questions. So I do, you know, we're about to go into questions, but I do want to emphasize that Reaching Higher holds this core value that our public schools are really the backbone of our democracy. Our public schools exist so that they can provide each and every child in the state with access to a high quality, robust education. And we really need to be keeping our students, our families, and our communities at the center of every decision that we make. And so when we read through these rules, that was the lens at which we were reading them. And so all of these concerns stem from that value. And so I just really want to emphasize that was our driving force behind these. And with that, you know, we'll open it up. We have a couple of minutes for some questions. So I'll kick it to Matt.
Awesome. Thanks. Great job, both Nicole and Christina. Thank you so much. It was super informative, and I'm sure everyone watching was able to take a lot away from that. So thank you. We do have just 3 questions in the chat right now. So if you're sitting at home watching or in the office watching and have a question, feel free to post it in our Q&A section, and we'll hopefully be able to have time to get to them. But our first one is in regards to which professional associations will the drafts be presented to, and whether we are able to speak to that or not.
I can go ahead and answer this question. You know, our knowledge base to date is that the draft has been shared with 4 professional associations. Those professional associations include our statewide teachers union. So NEA New Hampshire, we understand, has it. In addition to that, the New Hampshire School Boards Association, the New Hampshire Association of School Principals, and the New Hampshire Superintendents Association. And we understand that that was shared with them sometime over the summer, I think in July. And then it is supposed to be shared with other associations thereafter, but we're not sure what that timeline is and what that process looks like. That would probably be a question to send to the contractor, the facilitator of this process, which was the National Center for Competency-Based Learning, NCCLB, and you can find them on Google, or we're happy to share contact information if you reach out to us individually.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Next question is in regards to some of the edits that were made throughout this process. We talked a bit about kind of some transparency, lack thereof, or presence of it. But the question is essentially whether we're able to identify what the edits were made and who was making the edits, whether by the work group, whether by the NCCBL, or whether by the Department of Ed. And wondered if the questioner was wondering whether we could speak to that.
Yeah, so it's difficult to say without having public drafts, who did what where they came from, that kind of thing. We do know several of the work group members and hold them in such high regard. But we do understand that the process was very convoluted. There was a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of confusion. There were a lot of hands that went into that, whether it was from the organization itself or from the Department of Education. There's no real way, unless they kind of put those things public, that we would know who made what revisions.
Yeah, and I would add, the publicity of different versions or different drafts and how they exist. In addition, so that this brings me back to the top of the presentation and the comparison with the development of the Holocaust and genocide standards. Mm-hmm. And even just, the reflection of publicly available minutes would help share more insights on that in the process and what decisions were made by the work group versus NCCBL, as well as the education department.
Awesome, thank you. We have only a few more minutes, but I want to try to squeeze a couple more in. Next question that came in was when we were discussing the unbundling, and it was regards to whether any of the language that was added or removed was influenced by larger national organizations, and wondered if we could speak a bit to that.
Yeah, so we've been doing quite a bit of research on the unbundling itself. I haven't been able to find any boilerplate legislation, so I can't answer that. I think, though, that these some of the organizations that we've seen a lot of unbundling conversations from, particularly places like EdChoice, they don't necessarily publish their language, like somewhere like some other organizations do. So I haven't been able to find specifically, but in talking to colleagues in other states, I will say that New Hampshire can be a testing ground for a lot of these things, and so it wouldn't surprise me if this were the first state for things like that. That's just a note for this and legislation and coming up. So
exactly. Awesome, thanks. And I think we can squeeze this one last one in. It was in regards to the change to the word acknowledgement from mastery. And the question was whether districts would be able to establish or define their own language surrounding acknowledgement. Wondered if we could kind of talk a bit about that.
So my gut is telling me that's really a question for the group that designed the rules. At this point, we don't have insights to the origins of that change, or even their intent. So I would say, through when the public listening sessions begin, whatever that process may look like, because I'm not sure what that process is. But when that process starts, I think that is a critical question for students, educators, community members, to consistently raise, to better understand what exactly that language change is and what is the intended outcome.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I apologize for anyone whose question we were unable to get to, but you'll notice here on this slide are Nicole's email and Christina's email. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. But I'll pass it back over to Christina and Nicole to kind of close us out. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. I just want to jump in and say, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, or anything regarding this presentation, please feel free to reach out to any one of us. We are here. We are happy to have an email conversation, have a phone conversation. Let us know if you have any questions or comments or anything like that. But thanks for coming.
Yes, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to continued conversations on this topic as well as others. And we ask you or hope you have a terrific Wednesday.
Thanks, everyone.